hubby because he was listening to it. Hi everyone, we're
Hello
back.
there, Vancouver, Eddy Boudel Tan. How nice to see you in person.
Good to see you in person as well. Yeah, we had a bit of a technical glitch for anyone who was listening earlier, but it sounds okay. I don't hear any feedback or echo, so I think we might have sorted it out. How are you, Jeffrey? How's Toronto?
I, I, I'm doing great. Very excited to be here and to actually meet you face to face for the very first time. It's great.
Yep,
Folks will know that you
likewise.
are a first-time novelist, and your book is about to come out from Dundurn, and that's our connection. That's our link because I'm also a Dundurn novelist, but I'm not a first-timer. I'm the wise sage who is going to lend words of wisdom for this half hour that we're on here.
Yeah, and I'm the newbie. I'm the new player to the game, and I'm very excited. So, as Jeffrey said, my debut novel is being released in September. So, really quite excited. And one of the greatest things about this whole journey has been connecting with writers, both new and seasoned, and learning from them. So it's been such a fabulous part of the journey. So really excited to chat with you, Jeffrey.
Well, why don't we start off on that subject, talking about how you took an idea, you put it on a page, you got it to a publisher, and it's like a dream that's about to come true. Because I can tell you from my own experience and from many other authors' experiences, the first book is the hardest. It's the hurdle you need to jump to get through, to get over to whatever it is you want to do afterwards. And once you've done that, it's like a door opens for you into another universe, and suddenly you're allowed in, and you get
Mhm.
to have visibility and privileges that a lot of people would really like to have. But as I said, it's the hardest hurdle to get over. So what was your journey? Give us an idea of that.
Yeah, I mean, I've always wanted to be a writer. It's just like many writers, I think people grow up just dreaming of, writing a screenplay or writing a novel or a series. And I certainly had that dream growing up. I mean, I think I wrote my first book when I was 6 years old, just in foolscap paper. I got my parents to
Wow.
proofread it and edit it. I illustrated it myself. So it's always been a dream of mine. Even in high school, I was kind of the English and theater nerd, and I'd applied a writing contest, and it's always been very much a passion of mine. But the journey with this book, I think there's a certain level of insecurity that writers share. Jeffrey, you don't have to confirm nor deny, but what I've
I've got
learned.
three hands up right now.
Yeah, all right, good. So it's not just me. And you know what? I've really learned this, right? I've learned that writers, it's easy to share this degree of insecurity because, when we put our art on the page, it is very much like a piece of ourselves, right? Just laid bare. I think regardless of what you're writing, right? Because when we write fiction, even sure, there are stories that are imagined and characters that are imagined, but they're colored through our experiences, right? So, and writing this story was very personal to me. There's a lot of just personal elements and pieces of myself that are just infused in the narrative and in the voice. So it can be a little daunting and just being able to open yourself up to that level of vulnerability. And especially as a first time writer, you have that element of it, right? It being so personal. But then you also have this element of questioning whether you're good enough, right? I think it's one thing if you sought an education in writing and you took an MFA program and you had a feedback system, right, to kind of help hone that craft. But I think the majority of writers don't have that experience, right? So when you write something like a novel, there's always this questioning in your head, like, is this good enough, right? And I certainly felt that writing this novel. We're constantly seeking validation, partly because we need to, right? Because ultimately we write for ourselves, yes, but certainly for it to be read. So it needs to connect with readers, and that requires it to be perceived and received by the reader in such a way. So it was definitely a personal journey that involved overcoming that vulnerability and overcoming that I guess degree of insecurity, and just finding the right people to connect with my story.
I think you will never really give up that insecurity. Not you personally, but writers. I
No,
don't
I
think
don't
we
doubt
ever
it.
really give it up. We tend to hone it, and if we're really smart, I think we also channel it into the writing, so it can give a heightened sense of what we're going through. But it's a little bit like, as you said, it's a little bit like taking your heart out and putting it on the chopping block and saying, okay, here's this piece of me, and I'm allowing everybody to take a look at it. What do you people think out there? And that's the scary part, right? And you can say, well, it's not really me. I've disguised it as fiction. It's just a story that interested me and really got me, wanting to know more about it. But the truth is, if you're interested in it, it has to have something of yourself in it if you're going to engage other people. That's what I think. You can write cerebrally and other people will go, wow, look at all the big words and this person really makes nice sentences. But that doesn't capture us, I don't think, until you put the heart and the
Absolutely.
soul and the blood. And your novel, After Elias, has a lot of heart and soul and blood in it, I have to say. One of the things I love about it, because it's very profound, it's very deep, it's very dark, but there is something about it that says, hey, we're going to look at something that will scare you. We're going to take it to the ultimate extent that we can, writer to reader, but I'm going to hold your hand the entire time. So please don't be afraid. You don't have to look away. This is a safe place to examine some very deep subject matters: rape, suicide, robbery that ends in death, and of course the center of the novel, the plane crash, right? And I don't think I'm giving away too much by saying this, but that is the premise of the book. Do you want to tell me a little bit more about where that came from? Because I find it so fascinating that you said, I want to look into this thing.
Yeah, so I would say this may always be my most personal novel, right? It being my first. I think what I really wanted to write, and what I often label this novel as, is a modern day queer tragedy. That's what I wanted to write. That's what I wanted. That was the story that I wanted to tell, and something as an author that I think, when we think about what we want to write, it often comes down to, what do we want to read, right? Like, what are the stories that we want to find and discover and read, and what does not exist currently that satisfies that. So that's where I came at it from. I wanted to write a modern queer tragedy. So it kind of came down to, I really wanted it to get into. I really wanted my readers to really feel like they understand and know a character intimately. And that character, the hero of the story, Cohen Caraway, I really wanted people to just understand them intimately: the good, the bad, the ugly. And I often think that your true character comes out when it meets friction, right? When it's under pressure. Um, so what I wanted to do to reveal himself and all facets of himself is to put him in the most extraordinary situation possible. And the situation that I decided to put him in was, he is about to get married to the love of his life. He has this seemingly perfect life. He has this seemingly perfect fiance. And a week before his wedding day, he finds that his fiance who's a pilot, has crashed an airplane into the sea and has presumably died a week before his wedding. It's tragic. It's awful, right? But what I wanted to do is take that, that event and use it as a way for Cohen to kind of understand himself. And as he understands himself and all these different elements of himself, some that are more, intrinsic than others, have the reader come along, right? Have a reader come along that journey as he sure, as he deals with grief, as he deals with coming to terms and understanding his new reality, but through that, really understanding himself and getting a better understanding of himself, one that's more grounded in truth, right? One that's not colored or tainted by, your imagination or his aspirations or this person or life that he wants to be. So that was really the inspiration of the story. And it is grounded somewhat in a real life event. So some of you may remember in 2015 there was a plane crash. So a Germanwings flight from Barcelona to Dusseldorf crashed into the French Alps, killing everyone on board. And what quickly became evident was the co-pilot of that flight had locked the pilot, the captain, out of the cockpit and proceeded to fly the plane into a mountainside. And I just remember being so obsessed with this story, not just because it was tragic and terrible and gut wrenching, but I couldn't stop thinking about that co pilot, his frame of mind, and what would have driven him to do that. But then to take it one step further, I couldn't stop thinking about the people in his life, right? Who must have loved him. He must have had, partners in the past or even currently, friends, colleagues, parents, siblings, who must have loved him. And I just wondered, could they be that much closer to understanding, right, his motivations? So after Elias really follows people who are left behind in the wake of a similar tragedy.
And I think that's what's so compelling about your book. You don't focus so much on the tragedy, but the ramifications it has to everybody in Elias's life. And especially because everything is just building to a climax for him. Everybody he knows is coming down to an island off the coast of Mexico to watch him get married to Cohen, and none of that happens. And Cohen tries to do what he can to salvage things and says, well, let's have a celebration of life. And then it turns out that there might be more to the story than they're expecting. And that causes a lot of friction and a lot of grief. And it's the working through that becomes so compelling in your book. I'm just wondering, do you have a copy of your book to hold up to people? And I can show a copy of my latest book.
I do. Yeah, so after
Can
Elias,
you bring it closer so we can see? Right, so we can see the plane. Okay, right, there it is. Okay, beautiful cover. And I think if I'm not mistaken, that is Laura Boyle's creation. Is it that cover?
Sophie Pass-Lang.
I'm sorry?
The one I've done, Sophie Pass-Lang.
Sophie.
Yeah, so Sophie is one of Dundurn's internal
okay, I'm mistaken then. And here's mine. I don't know if you can see it. It's a little bit reflective, but you can see the cliff on it, right? Okay, so Lion's Head revisited. Lion's Head is a place in the Bruce Peninsula. What strikes me, we had a brief chat last night, and we seem to have a lot of crossover material in our writing, but what strikes me about the books is they are both about reclaiming, salvaging something from the past in a way to set us free to go on with the present. I want to ask you a couple of things about your characters, because you do have two antithetical characters, one who says, basically happiness has no meaning. So when his plane crashes into the sea, we say, aha, he killed himself, right? And which may or may not be true. The other one says, well, what's life without happiness? And you've put these two antithetical characters and you say, I'm going to marry these people, which never actually happens, unfortunately. What was your point in doing that?
Yeah, so really great question. Cohen and Elias are meant to represent just the differences, like the breadth of humanity in a way, right? They're very different people, and they're products of their own experiences, right? So Cohen, he's from Vancouver. He grew up in a fairly wealthy family, a fairly privileged background. He's grown up always having everything he's wanted, and he aspires to have this, this idealized reality, this idealized life. Elias is very different. He comes from a small town in Mexico. His past is quite mysterious, so I won't give anything away. But his experiences have formed him in a way where he thinks quite differently. He wants different things than Cohen. He believes in different things than Cohen. And I think that's what marriage or partnership or relationships are all about, right? Everyone is a product of their own experiences. And I think marriage is probably the most, probably the best example of this, where you take two different people who have different, um, you know, upbringings and different values and different perspectives, and having them build a life together, come as one. And some are much more successful at it than others, right? As we all know. So I wanted to kind of play off those differences, right? And in so doing, have them represent differences in class, differences in privilege, which are all themes that play into the story.
Yes, you have your main character Cohen, one of his best friends, Vivi, question his reasoning for coupling up with this person who is so different from him. And at one point, she basically accuses him of wanting to assimilate with the masses, and says things like, well, soon you'll be wearing matching Argyle sweaters and doing things that everybody else does. Is that something, because we're of a different generation, obviously. My generation was the one that was still fighting for the rights that your generation now has to a certain degree. I don't think we have everything we want. I don't think we can honestly call ourselves equal. I have a standard for that. I say gay people, the queer people, are not equal until we can walk down any street in any country in the world and hold hands with whoever we want. Until then, we don't have equality. But Amen. Is that something? Thank you. Is that something your generation wants? Do they want to assimilate, or are they seduced by the dream of equality and they want to pretend that they have it?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting topic, and you really nailed it in that fundamentally this is what After ELIAS is all about, is this question that you just posed. It really, when I call it a modern queer tragedy, what I mean by that is it really is meant to examine this current moment we are in our LGBTQ plus history, right? Where, at least in places like Canada, the LGBTQ plus community has more rights and more equality and more freedoms and more legitimacy than it's ever had in recent history. And all of that was fought for by previous generations, right? It wasn't a natural evolution. This had to be fought for tooth and nail. And the benefit of that, the result of that, is today, people like me, people like you, people like Cohen and ELIAS, they enjoy a certain degree of comfort, right? Of equality, of legitimacy. And that's what Cohen and ELIAS are really meant to represent, is, my generation's place in the spectrum or the evolution of the queer identity. Their identity as queer men isn't questioned. It's not a problem. It's not, it's not something they need to hide. They enjoy a certain level of comfort. They can get married among their friends and family and celebrate this union. They can dream about things like buying a house together and having children. All these things that are held up as, milestones in adulthood for our heterosexual counterparts. But the question that gets posed there is, we've been fighting for this equality. We've been fighting for the right to have these things. Is it really what we want, right? And this becomes clear in Cohen and ELIAS' story, where this is what they've been working towards, but this perfect ideal, but is it really what they wanted, right? Is this really what's going to make them happy, or is it just what they thought they wanted? And yes, we've achieved the ability to attain these things, but what have we sacrificed because of it, right? And where do we go from here? And I think that's really interesting in that it, when you look at my generation, and I'm an older millennial, I'm not I'm not that young. I eat a lot of avocado toast, but I still remember dial-up internet, right? I remember life before smartphones. And I think it's such an important thing to remember that, the comfort and the rights that we have today as a queer community, those were fought for. And in a way, the story of Cohen and Elias, it's a bit of a warning, right? It's a warning that basically don't get too comfortable, right? Because you can lose it just like that. For Cohen, he is, on the eve of achieving everything he's wanted to achieve and kind of fulfilling this dream of his, and he loses it all in an instant, right? Through the plane crash, he loses his fiance, and it forces him to really question his own life. And the same thing with the LGBTQ plus community, right? Like we have all these rights and privileges, and we fought really hard for those things, but we can lose it just like that. It can be taken away from us very easily, and we see that happening in places around the world where queer rights have actually regressed, right? Societies and attitudes and governments have actually become more conservative and more rooted in religious ideologies. So those things can be quite dangerous, and we shouldn't think that that can't happen here, because it can. So it is a bit of a warning. So to answer your question more directly, I know that was a bit of a roundabout answer. I think like it's very individual. Like with my generation, just like you said, discrimination still exists, right? Sure, everyone at work knows that I'm gay and I can bring my husband to functions, and it's just not a big deal. But we still think twice, right? Whenever we walk down the street and think about holding hands or showing affection. The first thing we do whenever we travel a lot, we love traveling, and the first thing that we do when researching a new destination is, how homophobic are they, right? Like, how dangerous would it be for us to visit this country? And I think your average person would be quite surprised at how limiting that ends up being if you look at it globally. So I think it's important to remember that the reality of what we've achieved is still quite limiting. But I think, with my generation, I think a lot of people do want those things, right? They want the matching Argyle sweaters, they want marriage and kids, and they have the ability to have those things, which is fantastic. But it's important to remember that, Stonewall wasn't that long ago. And I do think it's quite timely with this current moment of social unrest, right? People demanding for justice, demanding for equality, which I think is so inspiring. I think the progress that we've made as a queer community in terms of queer rights is such a testament of the power and effectiveness of these movements, right? Without Stonewall and without rioting and without people organizing, right, and demanding equality and justice, we wouldn't be in the place that we are today. And the same thing can be said for any of the movements that are happening right now, right, around all various types of rights, including the rights of, racial visible minorities and Black people. So, and it's so heartening to see kids, in the streets just fighting for these rights. And I think ours is a great testament of the power and effectiveness of that. I know I've done a lot of the talking, so I wanna hear more from you, Jeffrey, and I'm sure people watching do as well. So I'm really interested to hear from your perspective, because your first book was published in 1997, I believe, which wasn't that long ago, but still in many ways it was a very different world, both inside and outside of publishing. So I'd love to hear your perspective on how have things changed in terms of queer representation in literature. The reception from the industry as well as your readers. How have you seen things progress?
Well, sadly, not as much as I would have liked. I mean, we have had the major milestones of same-sex benefits through corporations, same-sex marriage, but that doesn't break down the invisible borders and barriers. There are some positive signs. I can remember going into bookstores even 5 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, and seeing, fiction and history and geography, and way back in the store, you'd see LGBTQ books, like one skinny little shelf back there, kind of usually turned to the wall. And if you wanted something that was out of the so-called mainstream, you had to go all the way back there and look for it. And I'm glad it was a literary apartheid, and I'm glad those sections are gone. There may be stores that still have them. I don't know. I hope they disappear quickly. There was a time in the 1970s that gay publishing took off, even here in Canada. I shouldn't say even here in Canada, because there's a poet, a writer, Ian Young, who claims to have had the very first queer press, and that was Catalyst Press. And it was quickly followed by a number of presses in the US. But when I was looking for a publisher in the 1990s, there weren't that many, and the ones that had been big in the 70s and 80s kind of disappeared for different reasons. But it took me 5 years actually to sell my first book. And I had to go outside the country. That was the most shocking thing. I think if I had gone outside the country initially, I would have had greater success, but I kept trying with Canadian publishers, and there were just no queer publishers here at the time. So I tried the ones that seemed, left-leaning and a little bit open-minded, but they still had their criteria, and their criteria was what is going to sell. And they didn't want to take a chance on my book, even though it's now proved itself many times over. But finally, somebody said, well, why don't you send it outside the country? And I was a little bit incensed to think that a Canadian would have to go to another country to get published. But that's exactly what happened. I sent one query to the US, one query to Britain, and they both said yes. And I thought, what have I been wasting all my time for? So I looked into that with that exploration outside the country, and that it's that magical hurdle that you are just about to cross that says the doors are now slightly open. And I know you've got a second book placed already, but you need to get over that first hurdle to get any other book published. And I have to say, 23 years later, it's still hard. Recently, I had a rejection from a major publisher. I won't mention the name, but the letter basically said, this is a book that is going to appeal to gay people only. And I thought, no, my books appeal across the board, and I should not be at this point having to defend having queer characters, having stories that tell gay stories. Because, thanks to Dundurn, that has been proved wrong over and over again. So it's still discouraging out there. And I would say if there are any younger writers who haven't placed your first book, turn over every leaf you can, and you just have to keep going, because we are still not entirely welcome at the party. You have to prove yourself far more than so-called mainstream writers. I think we deserve to be in the mainstream, but again, that's that question of assimilation. Do we want to be in the mainstream? Do we want to cut off our edges and say, look, we've cut ourselves down to fit your criteria? I don't think that's true. I don't want to do that. You haven't done that, and I haven't done that. Though I have one book, one literary fiction novel, which is actually on the wall. That's The Honey Locust behind me. That's a non-queer book. The characters are mostly women in that. So I know how to make that leap, but the book still has to come from my heart. I'm not going to create a character just to sell a book. And I think that's what it comes down to. Sometimes you just have to say, okay, I need to fit for the first book. I didn't do that, and you haven't done that, but you may have to do that. And I would tell people, if that's what it takes, then do that. And then your second, third book, write what you want, and always write your heart out. So long, passionate answer, but there you go.
No, I 100% agree. And I think it underscores the importance of us writers to tell our stories, right? The more of these stories that we tell that are successful in getting published, the more, I guess, legitimized and normalized it becomes, right? It paves the way, and it helps pave the way for future writers who want to tell their own stories that relate to the queer experience. Like, I just think about, like, what would have happened if we didn't have a James Baldwin, kind of paving the way, or all of the fantastic, queer writers today who are writing books who are proving that you can write a book with queer themes and characters and it can sell. And it's not just going to be, gay people who are going to be buying and reading it. I think that's just a flawed perception. And I don't think that's grounded in reality. So yeah, I do encourage that, if you're a writer, tell the story that you want to tell. Don't try to fit it into a mold. It's interesting. One of the questions that I'm often asked, not often, but I've been asked before is, are you always going to write queer books, like books with queer themes and characters? And my answer is yes, mainly because it's part of my mission, right, as a writer, is to improve and amplify and strengthen queer representation in literature. Like, that is quite realistically one of my main motivations of doing this. And that's not even taking into account that, I love writing through my experiences, right? And everything I write is kind of informed with what I've learned and what I experience and what I feel from the world. But I think it's important, right, that we all do our part to tell those stories, if that's what we want to do. And I'm not saying that, if anyone's a queer writer, they only have to write queer books. Like, that is certainly not the case. I feel, everyone needs to have the feel like they have the ability and openness to write the stories they want to write, and then find an audience for that. And then
interesting you say that. I'd like to hear what you say 20 years into your career. And the reason I'm saying that is because I have just put aside the queer community and queer issues as such and started a new series where the main character is ostensibly a straight guy. His best friend is a bisexual man. The book does take a little detour into queer territory because there is a lesbian couple in it. But I got to the point where I thought I've said as much to date that I want to say, that I need to say about the queer community. I'm not turning my back on it by any means, and I certainly hope my readers, my queer readers, will come forward with this book. But if I look back on the books I've written, I would say, if you said to me, what are they about? And I would always say they're about relationships, and relationships take so many forms. And I'm just at the point where I want to explore something different, but I'm certainly not saying I can't write about queer subjects in future. It's just that at this point I need a vacation.
Yeah, don't we all? No, I'm glad you say that, right? Because, it's, I think it's important to sort of write a diversity of stories and have a diversity of representation in our books. So when I say that I'm always going to write queer books, I wouldn't even say that I write queer books, whatever that means. It's just like you said, it's an element, right, in the books that I've written, and also in a lot of the books I enjoy reading. But it's not centering solely on that element in most cases, right? Just like you, I think I would classify my stories as stories that are about relationships, about people who are kind of on a journey of discovering themselves and kind of discovering the world and learning about life through that, being put in these extraordinary situations. It's less so about, their queer identity, right? But I do think it's important that, at least for me, like, I've made the conscious decision to ensure that there's that representation in my stories, right? Like, I want my stories to kind of reflect the world that we live in, and that's an element of that. So, a question for you. I know that we're going a little over time, and I'm hoping you don't mind this question. You said that.
I'm happy to stay and talk. Will we be cut off?
Awesome. Me too. Yeah. Hopefully, whoever's watching feels the same. But I'm interested. Something you said was really interesting in terms of, over the past, 23 years, diversity, queer diversity in literature hasn't progressed as much as you would have liked to see. And I wonder, and I don't know the answer to this, and I'd love to hear your perspective. You write like in a number of different genres, quite a diverse range of books. But some of your major series are very much mysteries, right? And one series comes to mind, your Dan Sharp series, where the detective is an LGBTQ plus man. So when I think of queer literature, it's easy for me to imagine things that are things like literary fiction. And I think in science fiction and fantasy, there's been a bit of an emergence of queer stories and characters. But I don't think of mysteries. That's one genre where I wouldn't have thought that there would be much in the way of representation. So, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that the mystery as a genre, is it further along or less far along in terms of integrating queer identities? And do you think that there are, I guess, challenges specific to writing in the mystery genre?
Well, I would have to tell you that one of the best mystery series across the board, regardless of gender, sexuality, is the Dave Brandstetter series, written by a man named Joseph
Mm,
Hansen, who died a few years ago, maybe 5, 7 years ago, in his 80s. Very successful. It started off, I believe, it's up here on my bookshelf somewhere. I could pull it out if I wanted to. It started off, I think, in the late 60s, but I get the feeling he was writing pre-Stonewall, just pre-Stonewall. And
okay,
the so-called normalcy of his life, his character's life, and his insight into straddling the boundaries between being an out gay man and, trying to work as a private detective, a private investigator in the straight world, if you would, is astounding. He's almost someone who didn't, Hansen is almost someone who didn't need liberation. He was self-liberated as a human being. He was not constricted by anything that society said, and that is
yeah,
subtly in all the books. There are 12 in total. But no, I would say rather that the queer mystery, the gay mysteries, are really well represented, and
okay,
partly that's because they sell very well. I never thought I'd be writing mysteries. I didn't start off as a mystery writer. I didn't read mysteries. And it was only when I couldn't sell my second book, I thought, well, I need to write something that sells to get me out there again.
sure,
And I thought, well, what sells? And I thought, hey, mysteries sell.
yeah,
Um, so I started writing them, and I didn't take them seriously at first. I started off writing comic mysteries. I thought, well, I'm just being funny, so nobody has to take this as serious.
uh,
And but it's interesting because I thought I need an internal writer who is my audience, and I chose Oscar Wilde. And I thought, if I can make Oscar laugh, if I can make Oscar feel moved by what I'm writing, then I'll be successful. After I had done a couple of the comic mysteries, somebody challenged me and said, hey, you need to take mysteries seriously. And at that point, I was ready to write a serious mystery. And that is where Dan Sharp came from. And
great,
that was the first book, Lake on the Mountain, is the book that won the Lambda Award. And I thought, oh, maybe I'm onto something here. Let's
yeah.
continue this. So this one, Lion's Head, is the seventh and final, probably final book in the series.
Oh, really?
Just yes, because I'm on to all these new people now, and they're pulling me in a
Ah,
very different direction. So we'll
yeah,
see what
what
happens.
happened?
But I did want to say something on that. I have always felt that genre writing was not respected as much as it should, as much as it can be, and as much as it should be, and that's a mistake because I think everything is genre. I mean, literary fiction is genre, mysteries, thrillers,
Exactly.
romance. These are all genres. Literary fiction, it's not like, a bunch of little things in this one big thing. I think we're all genre writers.
Yeah,
And what I felt was that those boundaries and borders that had been up so long from the literary community needed to be taken down so we could say, hey, here's a new frontier that we have not really explored. And I think Margaret Atwood is someone who does that brilliantly.
sure.
Handmaid's Tale, is it science fiction? Is it speculative? What is it, right? And that came
Yeah,
out 35 years ago. So she's been doing it quite well, and a number of other writers who have been working in genre traditions. and saying, okay, let's take this to the new level, because here's something we can really, dig into, and it's rich new material. So, 3 cheers for genre.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, and I think genre can be really difficult too, right? Just there are so many. I think most books kind of span multiple genres, right? I
Yeah.
certainly believe
Now,
that of my book. Yeah. So I can understand the need to have genres in terms of if someone loves mysteries and they want to find a mystery in a bookstore, then it's easy for them to go into the mystery section and do that. But I think, yeah, as an industry and as an artistic community, we can do a better job of recognizing the reality that genre is a very kind of reductive and limiting sense of categorizing our stories. But I'm happy that you said that. Yeah, I completely agree.
well, it'll be interesting to see where your book ends up, because it's a mystery, it's a thriller, it's literary, it's a little bit fantasy with all. We didn't even talk about the Aztec themes in it. It crosses so many boundaries, and I think that's why it's so rich. And those are the books that I look to now to read, because I don't want just something straightforward that takes me down the road and I think, okay, I've been here a million times, I know where I'm going to end up. I want someone who says, I'm going to surprise you, and then comes
Totally.
through with that promise. That's what I want as a reader.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm the same way, right? Like I don't want to be able to predict where it's going. And it's interesting. I'm in a stage now where we're kind of getting advanced reviews, right, from readers of my book, and most of them have been very, very positive. But I've had a couple of interesting comments where people have said, as I was reading this, I had no idea where it was going. Some people said it in a really positive way, but it was also voiced as a negative, as if they wanted to know where the story was going, which I thought was really, really interesting. Because for me, isn't that like a delightful experience, right? Reading something or watching something and just like having no idea where it's going to go and where you're going to end up, and hoping that the payoff actually does pay off. But yeah, I have found that quite interesting. And even picking a genre for my story was difficult for me to do. I didn't really know how to categorize it, so I had to work with my agent to kind of figure out how to pitch it, right? How to, like, if we were to go into an editorial meeting, how would we pitch it? Like they would want to know how we would classify it as. But I consciously didn't want to write something that followed too many of the rules, right? Like I do believe in breaking the rules. You need to know the rules in order to break them, but
Yes,
I
yes, you
think
need to know them first.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you don't want to just go blind. If you break a rule, you want to be conscious that you're breaking it. But I definitely believe
No,
that.
and that was what I enjoyed reading your book. Was I felt I trusted you to take me to this place that I thought, this is not going to be a waste of time. This is going to be a rewarding experience. And every single book should do that. It should say, let's go. I've got something to tell you. I've got something to show you. Trust me. And if you gain the reader's trust, you will be able to bring them back again and again to new books.
Yeah. Yep, that's the goal. Gain their trust. That might be
I sound like a parent, I think. But my books are my children in many ways. So
Oh, they are. Yeah. This is my firstborn right here, so it's quite special. It's great. So I think we're probably. I know we've gone well past time. Any closing thoughts? Any advice you want to give me, perhaps as a very new author?
I don't get the feeling there are too many blank spots with you as an author, but the one that I tell people again and again is have faith in what you read, in what you write, and also keep exploring. Don't stick to the same things that you read, because you're going to find what's on the other side of the fence may be so interesting you want to go there. And I mean, that's how I've ended up being a so-called genre writer. My genres are queer, comedy, mystery, and now thriller. I'm entering a thriller arena, so we'll see what it has to show.
Awesome. Yeah, looking forward to hearing more about that.
And yeah, I'm thrilled for you that you're embarking on this journey that will be rewarding and exciting for you. So enjoy it. Even the people online who you think, excuse me, are not saying the things that you hope they would say, they will remember that you wrote a book that took them in a different direction, and come back and see maybe what it actually meant for you and what it meant for them, and to see what further rewards you can bring them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we really have talked a lot because I'm losing my voice at this point.
That's probably a sign that we should call it. But
The hook will come in, take me
Jeffrey.
off.
This won't be the last time. And
It's been great.
enjoy
Thank you.
your weekend. And for everyone watching, also have a great weekend. And if you want to look for our books, my book again is After ELIAS. It comes out September 12th through Dundurn. And Jeffrey's latest book is Lion's Head Revisited, which came out in February. Is that right? February. So you can find them now in stores and online.
Great.
All right.
Thanks very much. Speak again.
See you later.
Bye for now.